My daughter wanted my house, so she sent me to a nursing home. But before she could sell it, I sold everything myself and taught her a lesson she'll never forget. Stay with me until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful, life-changing stories. I am 78 years old. My name is William Harper, and for most of my life, I believed I had done one thing right. I loved my family more than I loved myself. When my wife Margaret passed away 12 years ago, my daughter Emily became my whole world. I paid for her education, helped her through difficult times, and when she married Daniel, I welcomed him into our family as if he were my own son. People often told me I was too generous. They would say, "William, you always put others before yourself." And they were right. When Emily and Daniel lost money during the pandemic, I was the one who paid their mortgage for almost a year. When their business struggled, I quietly transferred money into their account without ever asking them to pay me back. I never kept score. That's what fathers do. 3 years ago, Emily sat across from me at my dining table with tears in her eyes. "Dad," she said softly, "we're thinking about moving closer to you. The kids miss their grandfather." Those words melted my heart. At my age, loneliness is something people don't talk about enough. The house becomes quieter every year. The empty chair across the dinner table becomes harder to ignore. So when Emily suggested that they move in with me temporarily while saving money for their dream home, I didn't hesitate. "This house is yours someday anyway," I told her with a smile. She hugged me tightly that day. I still remember her saying, "You're the best father anyone could ask for." I believed every word. For the next 3 years, we lived together. I paid most of the household expenses because I knew raising 2 children wasn't easy. I cooked whenever Emily was tired and picked up my grandchildren from school whenever she asked. Life wasn't perfect, but I was happy. At least I thought I was. Then little things began to change. Emily became distant. Daniel stopped including me in family conversations. When their friends came over, I often found myself eating dinner alone in my room because nobody bothered to call me downstairs. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. People get busy, life changes, but sometimes the truth whispers before it screams. One evening, I heard Daniel speaking quietly in the kitchen. "How much longer?" he asked. Emily sighed before answering, "I don't know. We can't keep waiting forever." I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Their voices simply carried through the hallway. "What if he lives another 15 years?" Daniel asked. There was silence before Emily laughed softly before saying something that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Then we'll figure something out." These words stayed with me longer than they probably should have. Still, I defended them in my own mind. Surely I had misunderstood. A father always finds excuses for his children. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Emily had gone shopping and accidentally called me while trying to contact someone else. I answered immediately. "Emily?" There was no response. For several seconds, I could only hear footsteps and distant voices. I was about to hang up when I heard her speaking. "He doesn't suspect anything." My heart stopped. Another voice answered. It was Daniel. "Good. The nursing home director said they have an opening next month." I couldn't breathe. Emily laughed softly before saying something that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "He'll complain at first, but he'll get over it. Besides, he's old. He doesn't need this house this big anymore." Daniel asked, "And after we sell it?" Emily immediately replied, "The realtor said we can easily get $890,000. That's enough for our dream house and a fresh start." Then she said the words that broke me completely. "It's not like he'll be around forever anyway." There are moments in life when your heart breaks so quietly that nobody hears it, not even yourself. I sat there holding my phone long after the call had ended. My hands were shaking. For 78 years, I had believed that kindness always came back to you, that family meant something sacred, that love given freely would someday return to you. I was wrong. Or perhaps I had simply loved the wrong people too much. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through every room in my house, remembering birthdays, Christmas mornings, and countless family dinners. This house wasn't just wood and walls. Margaret and I built our life here. Emily took her first steps in this living room. I held my wife the last time in our bedroom before cancer took her away from me. And now my own daughter was discussing which nursing home she would send me to so I could sell everything I had spent my entire life building. The pain wasn't that they wanted the house. The pain was realizing they wanted me gone. Over the next few weeks, I pretended that nothing had happened. I smiled at breakfast, I played with my grandchildren, I listened carefully whenever Emily spoke about the future, knowing very well that I wasn't included in it. But something else happened during those weeks. For the first time in my life, I stopped thinking like a father and started thinking like a man who deserved respect. One afternoon, I visited my attorney. He looked surprised when I explained my situation. "William," he asked carefully, "are you absolutely certain?" I smiled sadly before answering. "For the first time in my life, I am." We spent nearly 3 hours reviewing documents that had not been opened in years. There was one particular detail that Emily had completely forgotten, a detail that Margaret insisted upon decades ago. My wife used to say, "People show you who they really are when they think you've become helpless." At the time, I thought she was simply being cautious. Now I realized she was wiser than I ever understood. 2 weeks later, Emily approached me while smiling brightly. "Dad," she began sweetly, "Daniel and I have been thinking about what's best for you." I almost laughed at how perfectly she delivered those words. "Oh?" I asked. "We found the most beautiful retirement community," she continued excitedly. "You'll have friends your own age, activities every day, and professional care whenever you need it." Professional care. Such beautiful words can sometimes hide ugly intentions. "And what about this house?" I asked quietly. She smiled. "We'll take care of everything, Dad. You don't have to worry about a thing." Of course I didn't, because for the first time in months, I wasn't worried at all. I simply looked at my daughter and wondered when she had become someone I no longer recognized. I smiled back at her and said only 3 words. "That sounds wonderful." The relief on her face was impossible to miss. She thought she had won. She didn't know that 3 days ago, I had already signed papers that would change everything she believed she knew about this house. She didn't know that the house she was planning to sell for $890,000 wasn't going to become hers at all. She would discover that soon enough. But before that happened, I had one final lesson left to teach my daughter. A lesson about greed, gratitude, and the true meaning of family.
That evening, I sat alone in my study, holding an old photograph of Margaret and me. It had been taken the day we bought this house 42 years ago. We were young, smiling, and full of dreams we couldn't yet afford. Margaret always had a way of understanding people better than I did. "William," she used to tell me, "never confuse kindness with weakness." I smiled sadly as I looked at her photograph. For 78 years, I had done exactly that. The following week, Emily became unusually kind to me. She made my favorite breakfast. She asked about my health almost every day. Daniel even offered to drive me to my doctor's appointment. If I hadn't heard that phone call myself, I might have believed they genuinely cared. Funny how differently we hear words once we know the truth behind them. "Dad," Emily asked one evening while pretending to be casual, "have you ever thought about what happens to the house someday?" I pretended to think for a moment before smiling at her. "Not really. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason," she laughed nervously. "I was just wondering whether you've updated your will recently." There it was. Not concern, not love, just curiosity about paperwork. I noticed Daniel looking directly at me while pretending to drink his coffee. For years, I would have been hurt by such conversations. Now, strangely enough, they no longer had that power over me. The truth had set me free. That night, my attorney called to confirm that every document had been properly filed. "Everything has been finalized, William," he said. "Are you sure you don't wish to tell them beforehand?" "No," I replied softly. "Some lessons can only be understood when they're experienced." After hanging up the phone, I slept peacefully for the first time in months. 3 days later, Emily informed me that she had arranged a visit to the retirement community. "You'll love it there, Dad," she said enthusiastically. "There are gardens, libraries, and wonderful activities." "Wonderful," I replied with a smile. She seemed surprised that I wasn't arguing with her. People expect resistance when they know they're doing something wrong. My cooperation confused her. We visited the retirement community that Saturday afternoon. Ironically, it was beautiful. The staff members were kind and respectful. Several residents smiled warmly as we walked past them. For a moment, I wondered how different things might have been if Emily had approached me honestly. Had she simply said, "Dad, we think you'll be happier here. Perhaps we could have had that conversation together." But greed changes people. It teaches them to see opportunities where they should see relationships. On our drive home, Emily looked genuinely relieved. "This is perfect for you," she smiled. "Perhaps you're right," I answered quietly. I don't think she noticed the deeper meaning hidden within my words. The following month passed quickly. Emily began packing some of my belongings without asking me first. Daniel spent more time speaking with real estate agents than speaking with me. One afternoon, I walked downstairs and heard them discussing renovation plans. "If we repaint the kitchen and replace the flooring, we could probably get over $900,000, Daniel said excitedly. Emily laughed before replying, "I've already started looking at houses online." Neither of them noticed me standing at the doorway. They weren't planning my future anymore. They were spending money that didn't belong to them. I quietly returned to my room without saying a word. People eventually reveal who they really are when they believe there will be no consequences. Then came the day they had been waiting for. Emily informed me that she had scheduled my move into the retirement community the following Friday. "We've taken care of everything," she said proudly. "Everything?" I asked politely. She smiled confidently. "Absolutely everything." I almost laughed at those words. Almost. Thursday evening, Daniel returned home carrying a bottle of expensive wine. "Tonight calls for a celebration," he announced happily. "A celebration?" I asked. He smiled before answering, "New beginnings." I looked at my daughter sitting beside him and wondered if she remembered all the birthdays I celebrated for her throughout her life. The bicycle she wanted when she was 8, the college tuition I paid when I could barely afford it, the nights I stayed awake worrying about her future after Margaret died. Apparently, she remembered none of it. Children sometimes forget the sacrifices their parents quietly make. The next morning, I left the house earlier than usual. I wasn't carrying much with me because I had already moved the things that truly mattered weeks before. I looked around the house one last time before leaving. Some people might think I felt sadness at that moment. I didn't. I felt peace. There is something remarkably peaceful about no longer allowing yourself to be treated poorly by the people you love. By noon, Emily called to ask where I was. "Just taking care of a few things," I answered calmly. "You'll be back soon, won't you?" she asked nervously. "Oh, don't worry. Everything is exactly as it should be." Several hours later, Daniel and Emily returned home smiling and laughing. They had spent the entire weekend discussing renovations and dreaming about their future. They were convinced they had finally won. What they didn't know was that while they were busy planning their new beginning, I had already begun mine. Daniel inserted his key into the front door and smiled confidently. Then something unexpected happened. The key didn't work. He tried again, and again. Nothing. Emily frowned in confusion. "That's strange," she whispered. Daniel immediately blamed the lock. It must be broken. Then they noticed an envelope resting beside the front door, with Emily's name carefully written across the front. Her hands began trembling as she opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter from me. She immediately recognized my handwriting. The first sentence caused the color to disappear from her face. "My dear Emily, you once told me that I was the best father anyone could ask for. I believed you." By the time she reached the third sentence, Daniel had stopped breathing normally. 42 years ago, my mother taught me something important, that a person's character is revealed when they believe someone else has become helpless. Emily's hands began shaking uncontrollably as she continued reading. "Thank you for teaching me that your mother was right." Tears slowly filled her eyes as she realized where the letter was leading. But she still didn't know the greatest secret I had been protecting all these years, because the house she had planned to sell never truly belonged to her future. And somewhere inside that envelope was one final truth that would change everything she thought she knew about me, about this house, and about the inheritance she had spent years waiting to receive. What she would read next would leave both her and Daniel standing speechless on that doorstep. And for the first time in their lives, they would finally understand that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness.
Emily continued reading my letter while Daniel stood beside her in complete silence. "I have spent 78 years learning that love cannot be demanded and respect cannot be inherited. Both must be earned." Her hands trembled as she turned the page. "For most of my life, I believed that giving people everything would make them love me more. Your mother understood something that I never did. People don't always value what is freely given to them." Daniel quietly asked, "What else does it say?" Emily didn't answer him immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the paper in front of her. "The greatest mistake I ever made wasn't trusting people too much. It was believing that I deserved less simply because I loved more." For several moments, neither of them spoke. They had expected anger. They had prepared themselves for accusations and harsh words. Instead, they found grace. And somehow, that hurt them even more. Then Emily reached the part of the letter she never imagined she would read. "Do you remember when your mother passed away? You were 29 years old. Before she left us, she made me promise something. She asked me never to allow our love for our children to become permission for them to mistreat us." Tears slowly began running down Emily's face. "I promised her that I would always take care of you. What I didn't promise was that I would sacrifice my dignity in the process." Daniel swallowed nervously. The letter continued. 42 years ago, when we purchased this house, your mother insisted that certain legal protections should exist. She always worried that one day kindness might be mistaken for weakness." Emily suddenly stopped reading. "What does that mean?" Daniel asked anxiously. She slowly looked up at him before continuing. "This house was never intended to become a reward for greed. Your mother and I made that decision together many years ago." Emily's breathing became heavier with every sentence. "For years, I planned to leave this house to you because I believed you would treasure both the home and the sacrifices that built it. But inheritances are gifts, not obligations." Daniel immediately interrupted. "He can't legally do this, can he?" Emily ignored him and continued reading. "The day I accidentally heard your conversation about sending me away was the day I realized I was no longer living with my daughter. I was living with two people waiting patiently for my funeral." Those words hit her harder than anything else written inside the letter, because they were true. "I have forgiven you, Emily. Forgiveness isn't something we give because people deserve it. It is something we give ourselves so we can sleep peacefully at night." For the first time since opening the letter, Emily began crying uncontrollably. She remembered the countless sacrifices I had made throughout her life: the school tuition, the hospital bills, the birthday parties, the sleepless nights after she lost her mother. Every sacrifice I made had been given freely without ever asking for anything in return except love. And somehow, somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing me as her father and started seeing me as her inheritance. The final page remained inside the envelope. Slowly, she unfolded it with trembling hands. "There is something else you should know. 3 weeks ago, I sold this house." Emily's eyes widened immediately. "What?" Daniel shouted. She continued reading. "No, I didn't sell it because I was angry. I sold it because I finally understood that I deserved my own new beginning." Daniel grabbed the letter from her before she could continue reading. His eyes desperately searched for answers. "After all expenses were paid, I made several decisions regarding the proceeds of the sale." His hands began shaking. "A portion of the money has been donated to organizations that provide housing assistance for elderly men and women who have been abandoned by their families." Emily covered her mouth as tears continued falling from her eyes. "Another portion has been placed into educational trusts for my grandchildren. They are innocent in all of this and deserve every opportunity I can provide for them." Daniel's face turned pale. He continued searching desperately for the part about their inheritance. Then he found it. "The remaining funds have been placed into a trust that will provide for my care, my happiness, and whatever adventures I still have remaining in this life." There was absolutely nothing mentioned about either Emily or Daniel receiving any of it. Nothing. After several moments of silence, Emily quietly whispered, "That's all?" There was one final paragraph at the bottom of the page. "Finally, I leave you with one last gift, not money, but wisdom. If one day your own children grow old enough to care for you, I pray they remember the lesson that you forgot. Parents are not investments. Love is not a transaction, and no amount of money will ever replace a relationship that greed destroys. By the time you finish reading this letter, I will already be gone. Don't look for me. I am finally going somewhere that I am wanted, not because of what I own, but because of who I am. I have always loved you, Emily. That will never change. But loving someone and allowing them to hurt you are two very different things. Goodbye, my daughter. Dad." Silence filled the front porch for what felt like an eternity. Daniel immediately began making phone calls. He called the realtor, he called his attorney, he called everyone he could possibly think of. The answer was always the same. Everything had been done legally. There was nothing anyone could do. For the first time in years, they understood what true loss felt like. They hadn't lost $890,000. They had lost something far more valuable than money. They had lost the trust of the one person who would have willingly given them everything he owned. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, I sat peacefully beside a beautiful lake, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time in many years, I wasn't someone's responsibility. I wasn't someone's inheritance. I wasn't someone's financial plan for the future. I was simply William Harper, a man discovering that life doesn't end when people disappoint you. Sometimes that is precisely when it begins. As I sat there smiling quietly to myself, my phone suddenly began ringing. The caller ID displayed a name I never expected to see again. It was Emily. I looked at the screen for several moments before placing the phone back into my pocket, unanswered. Some conversations require time, some apologies require actions, and some wounds require silence before they can begin to heal. But what Emily didn't know was that I had already received something in the mail that morning, a letter containing information that would change both of our lives forever. It wasn't from an attorney, it wasn't from a bank, and when I finally opened that envelope, I realized that God wasn't finished writing either of our stories just yet. 3 days passed after Emily called me the first time. I didn't answer. Then came the 4th day, and the 5th. Soon my phone began ringing almost every hour. At first, it was only Emily. Then Daniel started calling. Later, there were voice messages. Finally, there were text messages filled with words I had been waiting years to hear. "Dad, please call me back. I'm sorry. Please let me explain. Dad, I don't care about the money anymore. I just want to talk to you." Funny how quickly people learn the value of something after they've lost it. There was a time when hearing those words would have immediately softened my heart. There was a time when I would have forgiven everything before they even finished apologizing. But age teaches us many things. One of them is understanding that forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. I had already forgiven Emily the day I wrote my letter. Trust, however, is rebuilt slowly, one honest action at a time. 2 weeks later, I finally opened the mysterious letter that had arrived at my new home. It wasn't a lawyer or a financial institution. It was my doctor. Months earlier, I had undergone several medical examinations that required additional testing. Because of everything happening with my family, I had almost forgotten them entirely. With trembling hands, I slowly opened the envelope. Then, I smiled. For nearly 6 months, I had convinced myself that I didn't have much time left. Perhaps that was another reason Emily's betrayal had hurt so deeply. I believed my remaining years would be spent feeling unwanted and alone. But life had one final surprise waiting for me. My doctor wrote that I was remarkably healthy for my age. In fact, he jokingly mentioned that I would probably outlive most of his younger patients if I continued taking care of myself. For the first time in months, I laughed aloud. Sometimes God closes one door simply because we are standing in front of the wrong one. That afternoon, I sat beside the lake and asked myself a simple question. If you were 40 years younger, William, what would you do with your life? The answer surprised me. I realized I had spent decades living for everyone else, first for my parents, then for my wife, then for my daughter. There is absolutely nothing wrong with loving other people deeply. The problem begins when we forget that our own happiness matters too. So I made myself a promise that day. I would spend the rest of my life living, not simply existing. Over the following months, I traveled more than I had during the previous 20 years combined. I visited places Margaret and I once dreamed about seeing together. I made new friends and discovered that 78 wasn't the end of life. For me, it was the beginning of another chapter. Meanwhile, Emily never stopped trying to contact me. Every birthday, she sent flowers. Every Christmas, she wrote letters. On Father's Day, she mailed me an old photograph of us together when she was only 6 years old. Written on the back were 4 simple words: "I miss my daddy." I must admit, I cried when I read them, because despite everything that had happened, she was still my daughter. Nothing in this world could ever change that. Almost 1 year passed before I finally decided to meet her. We agreed to have lunch at a quiet restaurant halfway between our homes. I arrived 15 minutes early. Then I saw her walking towards me. For a moment, I forgot she was 41 years old. All I could see was the little girl who used to run into my arms whenever she was afraid of thunderstorms. She looked older somehow, sadder, and when she finally sat down across from me, she immediately began crying. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered before saying anything else. There was no excuse in her voice, no justification, only regret. "I became someone I don't recognize anymore," she continued quietly, "and I lost the one person who loved me the most because of it." For nearly 2 hours, we talked honestly for the first time in years. I learned that after losing everything, she had begun attending counseling sessions. She and Daniel had separated for several months before eventually deciding whether or not to rebuild their marriage. More importantly, she had spent the previous year teaching her own children something she wished she had never forgotten: that grandparents are blessings, not burdens. Before leaving, she reached across the table and held my hand tightly. "Dad," she asked softly, "will you ever trust me again?" I smiled before answering honestly, "I don't know yet." Tears filled her eyes immediately. Then I continued speaking, "But I know I'll always love you."
At 78 years old, I have learned that life isn't black and white. People make terrible mistakes. Good people sometimes do selfish things, and broken relationships don't always have to remain broken forever. Forgiveness doesn't erase yesterday, but it can make tomorrow possible. Today, I am happier than I have been in decades. My grandchildren visit me regularly. Emily calls every Sunday, not because she wants anything, but she simply wants to hear my voice. And every now and then, she still says something that makes me smile. I love you, Dad. Those 4 words mean more to me today than any inheritance ever could. People often ask me whether I regret selling the house. My answer is always the same. No, because I didn't lose my home. I found myself. That house gave me 42 beautiful memories of marriage, but it also taught me my final and perhaps greatest lesson. A parent's greatest gift should never be measured in dollars, and a child's greatest inheritance should never be measured by what they receive after their parents are gone. Our greatest inheritance we leave behind is our character, our kindness, and the love we choose to give one another while we still have the opportunity. Money can build houses, but only love can build a home. And if there is one thing I hope you remember from my story, it is this: never stay where you are merely tolerated when you deserve to be cherished. Never allow kindness to become permission for others to disrespect you. And never forget to tell the people you love that they matter while they are still here to hear it. Because one day, all that remains of us will not be what we owned, but how deeply we loved and how gently we were remembered. My name is William Harper. I am 78 years old, and after losing almost everything I thought mattered, I finally discovered that I had lost nothing at all. I simply found my way home. The end.